Amen. Good to see you. Bless your heart. Now, those of you who are visiting, God bless you. I don't say this lightly. I say it sincerely. You need to come back when the pastor, you need to hear him teach. Because I trained him. But you'll be blessed, I'm telling you for sure, because he is one great preacher, and that's why he's out even preaching there in all places, Mississippi. But I want you to be back to hear him. I really, truly, honestly want you to come back and hear him. And I know you'll be blessed if you will. And so thank God for the opportunity. Now here's what happened. He took off to go to this Bible conference in Mississippi, one in which I've preached and will be preaching again next year, the same one that he's preaching in this year. I'll be preaching next year. And I think when he decided to do this, might have been when he first got the invitation to go out there and preach, that he came to me this week and he said, Dad, he said, you know that when you pastored the church, this church, years ago, you probably gave, no doubt, your life story. And no doubt there have been times when I have given parts and pieces in my messages of your life story. He said, when I'm gone this time, because there are so many people that have never heard your full life story, and so many others that may have forgotten some of the events of that life story, I would like to have you, if you will, in my absence, preach on this Sunday morning and give your complete and total life story. Would you do that? Now, I'm going to, and listen, what I want you to hear is, I'm going to read the psalm here in just a few moments, but I want you to give attention to something about what the Lord has done, and I want you to give all the credit to the Lord. I want you to see here that, first of all, you're going to see the providence of God. Unbelievable what God has done in his providence to cause me to ever hear the gospel and be saved. I want you to also not only to hear the providence, to see the providence, but I want you to recognize the power that God had in saving such a sinner such as I. I want you to see his power. Then I want you to see his purpose of why God saved me, and then to see the promises that God has done since he has saved me. And it all came through one thing that you and I lack most in, and it came, and you're going to see it at the close of my life story, it came because of somebody's prayer. Somebody prayed for me. And after that, you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about, because I really do believe it'll be a blessing to you. I had never given my life story before, since I had been saved for all those years. And I was preaching with Dr. Jack Hiles in Tennessee in a conference. And I just happened to mention just one phase of my life story in the message that I was preaching with him at. And after that service, he came to me and he said, Brother Miller, I did not know that about you. He said, is there any reason or any way that we could maybe schedule you to come, and I want you to give your life story at the National Pastors School. He said, we'll have anywhere between 5,000 to 8,000 people there, and pastors. He said, I want you to give your life story at the Pastors School. I did, at his invitation. And that just opened up many doors of different pastors and churches and conferences and all for me to be able to be invited to give what I'm going to give to you here in just a few moments. And I've been able to preach my life story to these different places. Now, here's what I believe with all my heart. I cannot touch another's heart with anything less than giving you my own heart. And I'm going to give you my heart today. This is not going to be easy. Especially in the absence of my wife. It's not going to be easy since she's gone to heaven. And she's part of my life story, a major part. But I'm going to do the best I can. And if I get a little emotional, I apologize for it firsthand. But I want you to see exactly the providence that God had in saving me. And by the way, if he had not saved me, you would not have the preacher or this church. I started this church in 1976, and my son, who's pastored the church since I resigned back about 13, 14 years ago, you would not have this church. Some of you would have never been saved had God not done what I'm going to show you what he did through his providence as a result of prayer. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things in Psalm 113 that we looked at here just a moment ago. Look at Psalm 113. In Psalm 113, we find these words, and I want you to see it for yourself. This is a testimony in my life. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust. The dust simply meaning the dirt. Poor in a dirty, filthy way. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust, and lifteth the needy out of the dunghill. I think everybody is familiar with what a dunghill is. They had out of one of the gates of the city, of the walls of Jerusalem, a gate that was called the Dung Gate. And that dung gate is where they took the human refuge, the human waste, and made a pile of human waste they called a dunghill. It's the worst stinking thing that you can imagine. But here's what God said he does. He says there that he raiseth up the poor out of the dust, out of the dirt, out of the filth, and lifteth the needy out of the dunghill. That's just exactly where I was in my life. I was in the dunghill of life. And he raised me up out of that dirt and that filth, out of that dunghill. Now watch this. What does he do with them? Verse 7, or verse 8. That he may set him, he lifts him up out of the dunghill, that he may set him with princes, even with the princes of his people. He raises them up out of the filth and the garbage and the wickedness of this world and gives them the opportunity to be in the presence of God's princes. You know who some of the fellows that I've preached with that are God's princes? I've had the honor of preaching and being with Dr. John R. Rice, one of the great heroes of the faith. And I'll give you just a small list of them. Some of you may not even know some of these since we're at the age that we live in right now. But I've been lifted up out of the dunghill to preach and to fellowship and to love Lester Roloff and B.R. Lakin and Bob Jones and Beecham Vick. I have been with J. Harold Smith and Tom Malone and Harold Seitler and Bob Gray of Jacksonville, Carl Hatch and Ed Nelson, and traveled with Dr. Jack Hiles for 12 years. He lifted me out of the dunghill and set me with the greatest preachers that America has ever known. That's why I want you to hear where God brought me from and why he set me with those that he had just mentioned, with the princes of his people. So please listen on purpose today. I want to give you my life story. Here it goes. Listen carefully. First of all, I want you to understand that I was born in Benton, Illinois on December the 9th, 1939. It tells you how old I am. I'm 81 years old. But I want to repeat it. December the 9th. I like on December the 9th to receive cards with pictures of our presidents, like $100 bills. Let me say it again in case you missed it. December the 9th. I like to receive cards with pictures of our presidents, and they're on $100 bills. Okay, but I was born on Benton, Illinois, December the 9th, 1939. That's a long time ago, folks. I'm an old man, but I'm an old man that has a lot of praise in his heart for what God has done for me. Now, here's what happened, and here's where the story begins. It begins, of course, when I was born, but secondly, it begins with what my mom decided to do. And what she decided to do when I was just 2 years old is to divorce my real dad. She divorced him, and when she divorced him, she moved with me and my brother and sister from Benton, Illinois to Chicago, Illinois. And she was there and set up a little place of living and got a job to support she and we 3 kids. While she was doing her job, she was working with military men. And what happened was that the military man that came into her life happened to be named Leo Miller. That's where I get my name, Dean Miller. I was only 2 years old. Leo Miller came into her life. They struck up an acquaintance, and then a relationship, and then marriage. My mom married Leo Miller right at the time that he was being discharged from the service, the Army. She then was able to pack up all her belongings and all the things that he had as well, and we moved to his home area where he was raised. My stepdad, was raised in Montana on a ranch. And so he raised me on a ranch in Montana. And bear in mind, I was 2 years old, but here's what happened. He was not only a rancher, but he was a strict, by name practice, almost practically only by name, because he didn't practice much, of the Catholic religion. But the first thing he did was get my brother and my sister into the Catholic Church. We were baptized into the Catholic Church. We were confirmed in the Catholic Church, and I went to the Catholic schools, and I served as an altar boy in the Catholic Church. I was a dyed-in-the-wool, 100% indoctrinated with Catholicism by the basis of my stepdad in my early young age. Not only that, but my stepdad was an alcoholic. He taught me how to drink hard liquor at the time that I was 4 years old and up. He had it hidden even from my mom, even in the barn and in the granaries. He had liquor hidden, and he would sneak us down, and I would be able to drink some liquor with him. And then he would brag to his buddies about how I, a little 4 and 5 year old kid, could drink hard liquor better than they could drink hard liquor. And he taught me how to drink when I was just a young boy. He'd even take me to the bars and show them that I could drink shots of whiskey without having what they called in that time a chaser, something to chase. After you take a shot of whiskey, you would have it chased down with maybe a drink of beer or something. So he taught me how to drink at an early age. So I was a Catholic, and I was a drinker. Then when I became a teenager, he sold the ranch, moved out of the ranch, and we moved to town. We moved to town, and when I became a teenager, guess who came on the scene that all teenagers fell for? Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley came in the 50s at the time that I became a teenager, and so he was an attraction to all of us teenagers. And I personally was attracted because I could play a guitar, and I was attracted to Elvis Presley, so I began to do the best I could to impersonate and imitate Elvis Presley. I could still probably sing to you Heartbreak Hotel, or maybe You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, or Don't Be Cruel. I could probably still sing to you Love Me Tender, or maybe even I'm All Shook Up, or Let Me Be Your Teddy Bear. I could probably sing to you Jailhouse Rock because I spent some time in the jail. But anyway, those were some of Elvis Presley's songs. And I would impersonate Elvis when I was a teenager, and graduated from that even to doing it in nightclubs and bars. That was my lifestyle. But here's the thing I want you to know. It was in 1958 that I graduated from high school, but during those high school years, I was taking counseling for my alcoholism. You would not believe what I could and how much I did drink, and spent most of my early teen years as well saturated with alcohol. But during that time, I had met my wife. I met her when she was 13. I dated her until she was 16. And when I was 18, I graduated, but also at the time of my graduation, I got married to my wife. She's 16, I being 18, and so I was married to her for 62 years. before she went to heaven just a few months ago. But I continued after I was married that lifestyle of in the bars and in the nightclubs and in the impersonation of Elvis, and I continued with my drinking. The counseling I got in high school did not help me much at all. So here's what happened. After 7 years of being married and carrying on that life of sin, wickedness, vileness, terribleness, horribleness, put my wife through, we moved from Red Lodge, Montana, where all that took place, to another town in Montana called Deer Lodge. And Deer Lodge, Montana is where the state prison, Montana State Prison is, and my brother was working in the state prison, and he invited me to come up so that I could see if I could get a job of just working in the prison. So we moved to Deer Lodge, Montana. I moved my wife into an ungodly, unbelievable place to live. My son mentioned it just the other day about it. It was a 10 by 55 old Champion trailer house. In Montana, the winters get awfully cold and frigid. And we moved into that trailer house, and we had nothing but trouble all the time of the pipes freezing, the sewer freezing. And I couldn't, because I spending all my money, my paycheck on my liquor and my lifestyle. We didn't have the money to hardly pay the light bill or gas bill for the trailer either. So I had my wife and my children now. I had 3 children living in conditions like you would not believe as I continued on in that particular kind of a lifestyle. I didn't get the job at the prison, but I began to work at the Chevrolet garage in Deer Lodge, Montana. At the Chevrolet garage, I graduated up to making from being what they called a grease monkey, where you did all the oil changes and grease jobs and those kind of things. I graduated from that into becoming a parts man. I went to General Motors in Detroit, Michigan, and became acquainted with what a parts man and the parts books and the parts ways of the Chevrolet dealerships. So I became a parts man. And I was working there in the garage. And I took every paycheck, which we got on every Friday, and literally, folks, I don't say this braggingly, and I'm not exalting my sin at all. And I certainly would not have ever done it now to my wife. So I'd take every paycheck, and on Friday night when we got paid, I'd head right for the place I always did, and that was Landon's Bar and Grill, and spend all of my money, almost all of the paycheck, on that kind of a lifestyle of drinking and smoking and doing the things that I should not have done. I was living in that kind of a lifestyle when I was sacrificing my wife. Something terribly, and my kids had no chance at all in this life. I'll never forget, I was drunk one night after getting a paycheck, and I was laying literally laying out in front of the Landon's Bar and Grill. They used to close the bars at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was laying out in the front of the Landon's Bar and Grill, so drunk that I was laying with my shoulder against the curb, and I was laying right out in the street. And it was after 2 o'clock in the morning, and I laid there, and I was so drunk that I can remember that if I'd moved my head from one side to the other, the motion of that would cause me to vomit. And I had vomited all over myself, laying there, covered in my own vomit. At 2 o'clock in the morning, traffic was no longer traveling up and down the street, but I was laying right there on the main street. And I was a little bit conscious of things around me, drunk, so I couldn't even get up out of that gutter. But I heard footsteps walking down the sidewalk toward where I was laying. And I listened to those footsteps as they moved closer and closer and closer to me. And finally, the footsteps were not heard. They had stopped. So I batted the blurriness out of my eyes the best I can and was trying to look around, and I looked up. And there was my wife, who had gone through unbelievable, ungodly type of a lifestyle because of me. And I looked up and I saw her, and she looked down and saw me covered with that vomit. So drunk I was laying out there. I'll never forget it as long as I live. As I laid there helplessly drunk, I heard her as she pointed her finger down at me, and I'm going to quote exactly what she said. She pointed her finger at me and she said, Dean Miller, Dean Miller, I hate you. And I laid there, not being able to move, as I heard those same steps that approached me to give me that message walk away from me. And I laid there hopeless and helpless. After a number of hours, or maybe even a couple of days, I was able to get my senses and get back to work at the Chevrolet garage. I walked into the Chevrolet garage, and I worked there for 3 or 4 days, when finally, after one of my other nights of that kind of a lifestyle, I walked in the next morning to the Chevrolet garage to go to my job as a parts man. And one of the mechanics back in the mechanic stalls hollered at me and said, "Hey, Miller." I said, "Yes." He said, "Have you heard?" I said, "Heard what?" He said, "Have you heard they hired a new mechanic here?" I said, "No, I hadn't heard that." He said, "Yeah, but guess what he is?" I said, "What?" He said, "They hired a preacher." I said, "A preacher that's a mechanic?" And that mechanic said, "Yes. And he's going to be a mechanic here to earn some money so that he can," I think he said he's going to be doing a church or building a church or working at a church or something. And this is the job he had to be able to make some money because he's a mechanic by trade. I said, "A preacher coming to work at a Chevrolet garage?" I said, "No, I hadn't heard that." He said, "Well, he's here. He starts tomorrow." Well, the truth is, folks, and I want you to understand this. Most unbelievable thing happened. It was on that Monday that man showed up to work, and he had heard the kind of a lifestyle that I'd already been living. But let me tell you what had happened between times, from the time my wife told me she hated me and the time that she left me, and I had to try to fend by myself and left her without any means to survive herself. Here's what happened. She had been pregnant with our 4th child. I did not know it at the time, and she did not know it at the time, but after she separated from me, she found out, and she went through the months of pregnancy, and she gave birth to the baby. The baby lived only 1 month, and the baby died. And we had to meet together, even though now, here's what happened. Listen to this. During that course of time, she had gone to an attorney, and she had drawn up divorce papers, and the sheriff had delivered the divorce papers to me over the parts counter there in the place where I was working. And he said, "You need to sign these." And I asked him what they were, and he said, "Well, I'm the delivery boy, kind of, sort of speak, but they're divorce papers." I said, "Well, I don't want a divorce." The sheriff said, "Listen, I'm not here to give you the counsel. I'm here to deliver what the judge has said, and you're to sign these papers. Your wife wants the divorce, even though you may not." I said, "Well, I don't want a divorce." And he argued with me for a little while, and finally he said, "Well, I'm going to leave them here with you, and I'll come back and pick them up." But I said, "You got to sign them." And he said, "All the places there that's got the little X on them, you sign, and that's signing of the permission of proceeding with the divorce." I said, "I don't want a divorce." And he said, "Your wife does." And she had gone. So here's what happened. We had a funeral service for our little baby. I was Catholic. She was a Mormon. Now we had to decide who's going to bury, who's going to perform the service of the death of the baby. We had to decide the casket. I had drunk all the money up. We couldn't afford a funeral. We couldn't afford a casket. And I'll never forget sitting there, my wife on one side and I on the other side, and we're trying to choose a little baby's casket. They brought in a real nice little baby boy. My grandson is named after him, who's here today. We named him Dace. And that's where my grandson got his name. That little boy's name was Dace. And we were trying to choose a casket. They brought in a little nice blue casket because he was a boy and told us the price. And I shook my head and I said, there's no way we can afford that. They said, well, we got one that's a little less expensive. It's not blue, but we'll bring it in. They brought in another one. I couldn't afford that. They brought in another one. And it was about 3 or 4 caskets they brought in. And finally, when we said no to all of them, and I looked over at my wife, and she's weeping like a mother would. And I couldn't even make a decision on how to have a funeral service or who would have the funeral service, let alone get a casket. And finally, they brought in a casket. It was a little styrofoam made out of the same material that if you'd go down here and get one of those styrofoam coolers, is a little styrofoam casket with a blanket on it. And I said, that'd have to be the one. That's the cheapest one they got. We had the funeral service, and I let her choose to have the Mormons do the service. And I want you to know that there was not one said thing, not one thing that would have given us any hope as to where the baby was. There was not one thing said that would give us any hope that we could be saved. There was no gospel. The Mormon brought the service, but gave no hope whatsoever or no comfort. And since we couldn't afford anything else that a funeral would normally have, I had borrowed somebody's station wagon car that my wife and I could take that baby into that station wagon, and the funeral director told us where to go, and we knew where the cemetery was, but they told us where to go to the cemetery, and if you go out there, they said that there'd be somebody out there that would wave you on in as to where the grave will be. So we went through the gate. My wife and I are the only ones together now, not even speaking, not talking, not even having any kind of a conversation whatsoever. Completely full of anger she was toward me, and I don't blame her. And we drove quietly out to the graveyard, and the guy was waving us on, and we went over and saw the little mound of dirt, and both my wife and I got out of the station wagon and went to the back, and I opened up the door, and there was that little casket, and the guy there at the graveside said, just go ahead and just set it right here on the dirt, and I'll take care of it from there. So we both put that casket on that mound of dirt, got back in the car, started driving away, and I'm looking in the rearview mirror of my car as I'm driving away, and I see them taking that casket and lowering it down in that grave. And I'm thinking, oh my God. I hear my wife sobbing her heart out alongside of me. And I'm thinking, I can't even give her comfort. She won't even talk to me. So I drive her back to the funeral home where she met with her mom and sister. And I dropped her off, took the car that I'd borrowed back. And where do you think first thing I went? To the bar. I had to get some strength through my liquor. I went back to work that next day, and that's when I found out about this preacher that was there hired as a mechanic. Now I want you to get it, because here it goes. I'm standing there behind the parts counter this one morning right after I found out that the preacher was a mechanic. And the mechanic was a preacher. And I'm standing there handing out parts to all of the other mechanics and some of the customers that were there. And the last one that stayed in line to come up to get the parts that he needed was that preacher. When everybody else had left, he walked up and he came up to the parts counter where I was standing. He reached into his pocket And he said, Dean, I've heard everything that you're going through. He said, I heard about you bearing your baby. I heard about your wife leaving you. He said, is your divorce final? I said, no, I've not signed divorce papers, and neither is she yet. He said, okay, I've heard about what you're going through. I even heard about your drinking problem. And he took out that gospel tract and he pushed it over toward me. When it came up my way, I grabbed a hold of that tract. I'm going to show you exactly what I did. I took it, I tore it in half. I pushed it back into his chest, and I said, I'm going to tell you something, boy. I am a Catholic, and I will die a Catholic. And you keep your religion to yourself. He turned around and walked away from me. The next day, the same scene. I was handing out parts to the mechanics that they needed, and customers were there. And I thought, all through that night, I'd taken care of my problem with that preacher. But that next day, I did not realize he was standing there like he did the day before, waiting till everybody left. And he walked up, and he reached in his pocket, and I wouldn't even look at him when I saw him coming up. I wouldn't even look at him. I didn't believe he had guts enough to do this. So I had my head down. And when he walked up, he reached in his pocket and he had this tract. And then he said to me, he said, Dean, look at me. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked up at him, ready to scold him. But when I looked up at him, I saw something that I had never seen as a kid growing up. I saw that grown man with tears running down his face. And I heard him say, Dean, I got up at 4 o'clock this morning, and I've been on my knees since 4 until time to come to work. And I've been on my knees since 4 o'clock this morning praying just for you. He said, please take this tract and read it. About that time, another customer was coming up, and I just took the tract from him because he was leaving, and I turned around. There was a typewriter behind me that I used to type out my parts orders, and so I threw that tract up on the typewriter. At noontime that day, everybody left the garage and was going out to lunch and eating lunch in the back or whatever. Everybody left during lunchtime. And it's that time that I took opportunity, because I wouldn't be disturbed because everybody was gone, to type up my parts orders, the ones I needed. So I sat down behind that typewriter, and when I did, there was that tract. I looked at it, and it said, What Must I Do to Be Saved? By Dr. John R. Rice. I stood up and I thought, I don't want anybody to see this, because I'm going to read that. So I went and shut my parts door. I shut the door to the parts room. And I began to read What Must I Do to Be Saved by Dr. John R. Rice. And as I read that message, and I read that God had the answer for anything, that he loved me, that he died for my sin, that I could be saved and go to heaven, that I could have a new life, and all of the things that were in that. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is what I need. So I just put the tract back down, and I thought, the only person that's in this garage right now is that preacher mechanic back there on that last stall. And I'm going to go back there and see if I can get a conversation with him so I can ask a couple of questions about that. But I don't want him to know that I read it, and I don't want him to think that I'm getting friendly with him because of the way I treated him. So I went back to talk to him, and I was very careful on how the words I used, thinking that he wouldn't know that I read that tract. So I used words that I thought that would not be a hint to him at all. But the very things that I was talking about and said and the way I said them, he knew immediately that I had contact with that tract. And so his response was, he said, Dean, I'd like to answer those questions, but he said, why don't I do this? Why don't I give you a ride home tonight since you don't have a car? Let me give you a ride home after work. And by then, of course, it was getting late at night, or I should say dark. But it was getting late because we had to do inventory, and we were late getting going. But we got in the car after I got done working, and we headed back to my house. We got to my house, and he stopped in the front of the house, and I opened the door to get out, and he reached over and grabbed a hold of my leg, and he said, no, shut the door a minute, Dean. He said, I want to talk to you. And he reached up, and this will tell you how old the car it is. He reached up and flipped on the dome light. And he said, let me show you some things. And he reached in his pocket and pulled out his New Testament. And he went through what we're familiar with, known as the Roman road. Romans all the way through, till he came to Romans chapter 10, verse number 9. That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. And as he was now ready to go to Romans 10:13, for whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, before he got to that one, I happened to look up and look out the window. And when I looked out the window, I want you to know, I saw a person walking across our yard toward my door of my house. And I looked, he was still talking. And I looked, I thought, who could that be? And then I realized, when I first saw who it was my wife. She was coming back to get more of her clothes and to get more of her things. And she was walking to the house. And I said to him, his name was Bill Wickham, I said, Bill, I said, that's my wife. He said, are you sure? I said, that's my wife. He jumped out of the car and he said, Mrs. Miller? She said, yeah, who are you? He said, well, I'm Bill Wickham. I'm a pastor, and I was just showing your husband here how to be saved. She said, good, he needs it. That's exactly what she said. And he talked her into letting him come in and motioned for me to come in out of the car to come in with him. I got in the house with her, still not speaking. He knowing that she was a Mormon because he talked to me. He did something that I thought was just absolutely great. He took his Bible, and without showing her the verses, he quoted her the verses and then asked her if she understood those verses, and she said she did. Now, we had a little old couch there in the house. I'm going to show you exactly what happened. When he went through that plan, he'd already gone with me, and then when he went through it with her, he took his Bible, and it was opened. He opened it up to Romans 10:13. And then he said, Dean, come here. So I came over there, and the Bible was open on that couch. And he said, I want you to kneel here by this couch, Dean. And I thought, kneel? I'm familiar in kneeling. Catholics do that all the time, you know, even in their services. So I came over and knelt down. And he said, Mrs. Miller, come here. And she hesitantly looked at him. He said, it's all right, just come here. So she came over to where I was, and he said, do you kneel down there by your husband? And she reluctantly, but knelt down beside me. And he took my hand on top of the Bible. And he reached over and took her hand and put her hand in my hand. And we haven't held hands up until that time for who knows how long. And her hand was in my hand on that Bible. And then he pointed to the verse 13. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And that night of October 5th, 1965, my wife and I in Deer Lodge, Montana, called upon the Lord, both of us, and both of us accepted Christ into our hearts, and both of us got saved I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, there was a change that took place in my life at that particular time I cannot explain to you. I went down on my knees in that house, a lost, dying sinner on his way to hell. And because of the truth of that Bible, I accepted Jesus Christ into my heart, and both my wife and I got saved. Here goes. Now, I'm going to be as quick with this as I can. But shortly after that, after we attended his little church that he was starting for a short time, and just now becoming acquainted a little bit with the Bible, my parts department changed my job, and I had to go to Billings, Montana, from Deer Lodge, Montana, which was 300 and some miles away, and I had to assume a job there in Billings. I'm showing you the providence of God right here. After we moved to Billings, Montana, I was there for a short time. We were unloading our U-Haul trailer to get into our little apartment. We were in the back, and in the back there we had alleys, and the alley was open, and here comes a car right down the alley while we're unloading some of our things that we just moved from Deer Lodge now to Billings. And as we're unloading, this car comes down the alley, and a guy comes driving down, and he rolls down his window. He said, "Hey, are you the Millers?" I thought, how in the world did he know? Well, come to find out, that pastor who led me to the Lord had called that pastor in Billings, Montana, and told him where we were and what house we lived in. And here comes that pastor of the Westside Baptist Church down that alley while we're unloading our stuff. And he rolls down the window and says, "Hey, are you the Millers?" He said, "I am Pastor Storrs, Pastor Ron Storrs." He said, "I'll be by to pick you up in the morning. I'll see you about 9:30 to get you in Sunday school." And he didn't even get out of the car and meet us. He just drove on away, which meant, and that was a plan on his, because he knew that we couldn't say no, because he's going to come pick us up. Well, he came and picked us up. Bless God, I started attending the Westside Baptist Church, and after having been there a few weeks, he had gotten up and preached on a Sunday night in that little church about the need of America having the need of young men who would be preachers of the gospel. I still had cigarette smoke stains on my finger from smoking 2.5 packs of Camel cigarettes every day. I had gotten the victory over smoking, but I still had the stains, and I had gotten over the drinking of the liquor, and I was now attending church and really battling that problem with my liquor problem. I hadn't drank anymore, but I'm telling you, it was still there pulling on me. But I started going to that church, and he preached on how America needs young men to surrender the ministry. So what I do, I go forward. Well, here's what happened. He could tell that I was under conviction about that while he was preaching. And he said, we're going to sing an invitation hymn called "Softly and Tenderly, Jesus is Calling," calling for you and for me. And we did. Now, there's not 7 stanzas in that song, but we sang 7 stanzas of that song because he kept pointing to me, "Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling," and he's calling for you. I thought he was pointing to me, but he wasn't, he said. And so down the aisle I came. I'll never forget when he was singing those songs, that invitation song. I'd step out in the aisle, and I thought, what am I doing? My wife was looking at me, what are you doing? And so I'd step back in. He'd say, let's sing another stanza. So I'd step out. And finally, after about 4 times of stepping out in the aisle, I ran down that aisle, and I said, "Brother Storrs, I believe God may be calling me to be a pastor, a preacher." And boy, he hugged me, and he said, "You're the first one to surrender to the ministry under my ministry." And he said, "Thank God." Well, here goes. Now watch this. I want you to give this to you very quickly. He had a revival meeting, and the revival meeting was going to be with a preacher from Denver, Colorado, and the man who was the preacher was the president of the Denver Baptist Bible College in Denver, Colorado. And when Brother Storrs, my pastor, told him that I had just been called to preach, he's recruiting me to come to his Bible college in Denver. He told me how to resign my job. He told me how he would take care of me if I would come. And to make a long story short, my wife and I again loaded that old U-Haul trailer with a 57 Buick. Boy, what a car. I wish I had it now. A 57 Buick, and we loaded everything we had, and we headed for Denver, Colorado to go to Bible college. Now, I'm going to cut everything out and just tell you this. Here's the miracle. Here's the providence of God. While I'm in Bible college, my wife gets a phone call, and the phone call is from a man who said, would you happen to be the Millers from Montana? My wife said, we are. He said, I need to meet with you and your husband as soon as possible. I'm here in town just for a short time. Can I meet with you? She said, well, I'll call my husband and find out. He's at work. I'll call him and find out. Make a long story, she did. And I said, okay, we'll meet with him. Had no clue who he was. We met with him in his motel room. We're sitting in his motel room, and he said, I have looked for you for 26 years. I was 28 at that time. He said, I've looked for you for 26 years, not knowing where your mom took you, not knowing where you lived, not knowing, having any idea where you were or if you were even alive. But he said, I finally found out a way that I could find out if it was you, and that's why I'm meeting with you. I want to find out, are you the Dean Miller from Montana? And if you are, I said, well, I am. He said, then you know who I am? I said, I have no clue. He said, my name is Butch Brzezinski. And he said, I'm your uncle. I said, uncle? He said, yeah, I'm from Benton, Illinois. I said, that didn't mean anything to me. He said, how would you like to meet your real dad and all of your other aunts and uncles? I said, are you kidding me? I just talked to my dad this morning. He said, no, you didn't. My mom and my stepdad had never told me that I was adopted when I was 2 years old. I thought he was my real dad. So I get on the phone and I call my mom and I said, Mom, I got a fella sitting here with me and his name is Butch. I said, what's your name? He said, Brzezinski. I think I just shook my head at that name, but I said, Mom, he said his name is Butch Brzezinski. Do you know what Butch? Silence from my mom. She's not saying a word. I said, Mom, and then I heard her go. I said, Mom, is this really my uncle? Do I have a real dad I've never seen? And she's weeping, and she said, oh, son. She called me Deanie. She said, Deanie, I'm so sorry. I said, Mom, what in the world is going on? Dad's not my dad, and I have a real dad that I didn't know I had. He's in... Make a long story short, my uncle who found me reached in his pocket, and to a college student, he handed me a roll of money. It was only about $150, but back then it was like it was $1,000. He said, I want to pay for your way to come back out to Benton, Illinois. We're having a big reunion. I want you to meet all your family. It was during Thanksgiving time, and my wife and I and the kids, we drove out because we had the money to do it now. We got there in that house of my uncle's in Benton, Illinois. And I'm standing there, and pretty soon my uncle that found me said to my wife, or to his wife, take his wife and kids and go in the kitchen. He said, I'm going down the block here, and I'm going to get his dad. My heart started pounding. I thought, what do I say? What am I supposed to say to this guy? So he drove down, and they drove back, and I heard the gravel out there in the front of the house as the car tires roll over it, and I knew that they were back. And I'm standing there in the living room all by myself. So I moved myself away from the door as far as I could because I didn't know what to expect. And then I heard the door open, and I saw the man step in. And he stepped in. He said, Dean? I said, yes.
He said, "Oh my God, son. Oh my God." And he ran over and he got a hold of me and hugged me. He said, "Can you ever forgive me?" I said, "For what?" He said, "For the way I treated your mom and for the divorce." And I said, "Listen, if God can forgive me for everything that I've done, I can certainly forgive you for anything that you have done." And we had a tremendous reunion. Now here it is. And he said, "There's somebody you have got to meet." And he said, "Come on, get in the car with me." And I got in the car and we drove about a mile down. And we stopped in front of a house and we walked inside the house and we walked down a hallway. And the hallway in that house, there was a bedroom that had the door closed. And he opened the door and he stepped in and he said to me, he said, "You stand right here for a moment, Dean." And he stepped in that bedroom, and when he did, the door opened enough where I could see there was an old man and an old woman in two separate beds. And he stepped in. He said, "Grandmama, Grandpapa, you'll never guess who's come to visit you." And he reached out in the hallway and pulled me into that room. And he said, "You'll never guess who this is." And my little old 96-year-old grandma brought her hands out of those covers, those old wrinkly, bony hands, and pointed that finger. And she said, "Oh, I bet I know who that is." He said, "Who?" She said, "That's Deanie, isn't it? That's Deanie." And I went over and I got a hold of her and hugged her in that bed. And she said, "Deanie, we have prayed for you not knowing where you were. We have prayed for you every day for 26 years, not knowing where you are or where your mom took us. But there hasn't been a day go by but while we haven't prayed for you." And I left her side after a minute and went over to the other bed to my grandpa, who was 94 years old. And we hugged and embraced. And then pretty soon he took me by the shoulders and pushed me away from him. And he said, "We have prayed for you every day." And he said, "Dean, do you know what I am?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "I'm a Baptist preacher and have been for 50 years. I'm a Baptist preacher." And he said, "You have two of your uncles that you're going to meet that are Baptist preachers. And we've all prayed for you for over 26 years, not knowing where you were." Now, ladies and gentlemen, do you think prayer works? Do you think while they were praying for me that God saw me laying in the gutter and no hope, divorce papers, a dead baby, and a family to raise that's going to be raised either Catholic or Mormon? And God heard the prayers of those people for 26 years and took a preacher, an independent fundamental Baptist preacher, and sent him to that town of Deer Lodge, Montana to get a job in the very place that I worked. And for that preacher to give me a gospel tract that gives me the plan of salvation so I could read that tract and be saved. Do you think God was in that at all? Do you think God answers prayer? Well, let me ask you this question, if you think. I'm just going to ask you the question and be honest. God's watching you right now. Be honest. Who's here today that you have a lost loved one that's going to go to hell if it doesn't get saved? And you're burdened for that lost loved one. Let me see your hand. Let me see. Look at the hands all over the place. Yeah. Now the next question is, how much have you prayed for them? That's right. For 26 years? Or 26 hours? Or for 26 minutes? How much have you really prayed for them? If God does answer prayer, and he answered the prayer of my grandma and grandpa and all my Brzezinski side of the family and prayed for me for 26 years, and God answered their prayer by sending that preacher to me to give me the gospel, you know what? I love this, and I'm through, but listen to me. Because I got saved, your pastor is the pastor of this church. He would have been either raised a Catholic or a Mormon.
and lost in sin. Had it not been for somebody who prayed for me to get saved, that I could lead my family. I got to lead my dad. I got to lead my sisters, my half-sisters. I got to lead all of my whole family to Christ. I have my son, Dean Miller, who's named after me, pastoring a church, a great church of over 600 to 800 people right now. While I'm preaching here, he's preaching to 600 to 800 people right now in Fort Collins, Colorado. My son, Dean Miller, is preaching. My son, Matt Miller, the pastor of this church, is preaching. My son, Charles, is probably one of the greatest gospel singers and musicians you'd ever heard with gospel music in your life. Both of my daughters had married preachers because somebody prayed for me. Somebody prayed for me. And I got two of the most lovely daughters. I just spoke with both of them yesterday. My daughter Kendra, my daughter Brenda, and oh, how I love them. And my son Charles, my son Matt, my son Dean, and my wife and I, we got together after we got saved. And we made a commitment to each other that we would hold on to each other until death do us part. And we're only parted right now for a short time because she's gone to heaven. But I want you to know something. It's only because of what God was able to do to an old drunken lost sinner on his way to hell that couldn't get the deliverance over his addiction and had sin in his life beyond measure. I can't even tell you the sins that were committed by this guy right here before I read a gospel tract that somebody gave to me, and before I got on my knees and accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. He delivered me and cleansed me. I'm no longer guilty of any of those sins I've ever committed. And right now, while I'm preaching, listen to this, right now I'm preaching, God has said in his Bible that I remember your sins no more. And then right now, while I just told you about the sins, God is saying, well, I didn't know that. Because God had forgotten. Now listen, this book is true. And if you don't know that you're going to heaven, and if there hadn't been a change in your life, you could know that today. And I'm going to ask you, would you look down on the depths of your heart for a minute? Just look at your own life. Look at your future. This world is going to come to a close one day, and if not, your life is going to come to a close, and you better be ready, because I'm telling you, this is true. This book is true. Salvation is true. And what that man showed my wife and I that changed our whole life and the lives of many others, if you'll allow that to happen in your heart, your life can be absolutely the most glorious and wonderful life in the whole universe, because you'll know that when you do come time to die, you're going to be with him. You're going to heaven, but you're going to have to accept Jesus Christ into your heart personally, individually, not religion, not denomination, not anything else that you can ever do, except just believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and accept him as your Savior, and thou shalt be saved. And if you're not saved today, you could be saved and go to heaven when you die. And I'm telling you that publicly, and you need to do what you're going to do for God publicly. And here's two things I'm going to give you an invitation to do. If you really do believe the story that I just told you is a direct answer to prayer, and it is, and how God arranged it all to happen, and you've got a loved one that you know is lost, you need to come to this altar in just a few moments, and you need to call that loved one's name out to God and begin a prayer for them that you can pray for often, that they'll be saved. And number two, if you're here today and you don't have peace in your heart that you're going to heaven for sure, 100% sure, you need to accept Christ into your life. You need to do it today. Today, not tomorrow. Now, within this hour. So I'm going to ask you if you will stand with me to your feet, please. Everybody standing. And with our heads bowed and our eyes closed, and we're going to have an instrument of music in just a few moments. I believe it'd be a crying shame against God, against you, and against your loved one or against your friend you're thinking of if you wouldn't take the opportunity to come and kneel at the altar, an old-fashioned altar, and literally call their name out to God in a church altar and pray for them. I believe that'd be a shame if you don't. And then if you're here and you're not saved, I want you to come and do what my wife and I did that changed our lives and our family for all these years. And that's accept Christ as your Savior. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed. Who's here? Say, Brother Miller, I'd like to be saved today. I'd like to, right here where I'm standing in this church, I'd like to ask Christ to be my Savior. I'd like to be saved today. Would you raise your hand right now? Let me see it. I'd like to be saved today. I want Christ to be my Savior. I'm not saved, but I'd like to be. Would you do it? Come on. Hold up your hand. Let me see it. Hold up your hand. God bless you. Thank you. God bless you. And you. Thank you. Who else? Hold up your hand. All right, as the instruments play and we're led into a song, you come right now. And don't waste any time. You come right now. Come on. All over this building, you need to come. Say yes to God right now. You got a loved one on your heart? Don't you?